Hi, I'm Candice Malcolm with True North, and welcome to the very first episode of the True North Spring Speakers Series. The series is launched so that we can sit down with some of the world's greatest thinkers, some of Canada's most prominent intellectuals and public leaders to have more in-depth conversations about ideas and the state of the world, the state of conservatism in 2020. So our first guest today is Douglas Murray, the British author and journalist. Douglas is the author of the 2017 book, The Strange Death of Europe, and his most recent book, The Madness of Crowds, looks into cancel culture and identity politics and how all of this fighting and division is really tearing our society apart. So this event was co-sponsored by Civitas Canada. Civitas Canada is a society for public intellectuals and thinkers who are classical liberal, conservative, or libertarian. We have annual get-togethers, and this was one of those meetings. So after my 30 or so minute interview with Douglas Murray, we opened it up to a live audience. The live audience was made up of Civitas members who were able to ask their questions and engage in a conversation with Douglas, which allowed us to talk about so many great and interesting topics. Here's that interview. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining our meeting today.
Well, thank you, Candice. It's a great pleasure to be with you and your friends and colleagues over there. So thank you.
I've really been wanting to get your take on the current situation we find ourselves in the world right now, with not only the coronavirus pandemic, but also the resulting lockdowns. So just off the bat, do you think that the government has gotten things right? Do you think that they've went too far, not far enough? What is your take on the sort of current situation we're in right now?
I'm slightly disappointing in some of my readers for having a rather commonplace opinion on this matter. I think it depends, obviously, country by country. Most of our country leaderships have done fairly similar things. There have been some outriders like Sweden, but most, certainly the world's democracies, have acted in similar ways, enacted similar measures. I mean, I think that what I would say at the moment is it looks like, touch wood, it looks like in both our countries, we've managed to duck what was predicted to be worst case scenario. Certainly in the UK, we haven't had a situation that we were fearing at the very beginning. Suppose it's inevitable then that the debate happens whether or not that's because of things we've done, or it would have been the case anyway, or it would have been better anyway. I am very skeptical myself about people who profess to be experts in virology who never wrote about pandemics or thought about them until 6 weeks ago. And I think there's a very, very fine judgment call that has to be made on this. And it isn't only the territory of the virologists and the experts in pandemics, because obviously there is also the necessity of the economy, which is in a situation I think we could never have predicted as being this bad. So obviously these are competing forces and questions at the moment. I think it is a very fine judgment call that has to be made. I don't envy the political leaders who have to make it, incidentally. But I am concerned, at any rate, about some of the stuff that sort of floats around that is, I'm sure comes across your desk as it does mine, which likes to present this as some kind of, grab by government and so on. And I mean, look, we are all in a totally unprecedented situation. The American government's done something not that dissimilar to doing UBI as a one-off. And, a news in brief headline the other week in the UK was that 1 in 20 people had lost their jobs that week. That was like down the bottom of the page. So I'm very cautious about this. I follow what is, I think, the mainstream opinion on it, simply because I have no special insight or expertise that would give me the confidence to differ as radically as you would need to differ from it in order to denounce all the governments like those of Canada and Britain as having been in some ways wrong.
It's interesting that you mentioned Sweden, though, because one of the biggest sort of differences between how the UK, Canada, the United States, and most of Europe, most of the world combated this was sort of a knee-jerk reaction to shut everything down, lock everything down. And of course, we had such limited knowledge at the time about what the infection rate was, what the death rate was, all those kind of things. But you look at Sweden, and they kind of issued guidelines, general guidelines, but ultimately they trusted the citizens to be responsible. Whereas when you look at what the Canadian government did, what the UK government did, I mean, it doesn't seem like there was much reflection on upholding some of our sacred values, including for Canadians, values in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms,
Sure.
basic things like freedom of mobility, the right to a timely trial if you're charged with a crime, or of course economic rights, or at least the right to pursue a livelihood. There wasn't really given any thought into those things, and now we're 6 weeks deep here. So maybe you can reflect on the lack of that.
I just mentioned two things. That one is I've been used all my life in absolutely every area and discipline to there always being a Swedish alternative. It's always a Scandinavian alternative. Some ways, sometimes it's Norway, the Norway option. The reason I mention this is because in almost every area that a Scandinavian precedent is believed to be desirable in countries like America, Canada, or Britain, the people advocating it, whatever it is, left wing, right wing, whatever, always forget the very unique nature of Scandinavian societies. And I mean, without getting too deep into it, I think that is a significant factor in that. I wouldn't like to see, say, the French government of Emmanuel Macron try the same kind of trust in the people as the Swedish government has done. In the UK, as I understand it, which is a country obviously I know most about in this pandemic, as I understand it, the main problem in government, the main thing that triggered the decision to have the lockdown was that the government believed that it was quite likely that the National Health Service was going to be swamped very swiftly, that there weren't enough ventilators, weren't enough beds, and that within a very short space of time we'd have pictures across the media of people dying, gasping outside of hospitals. And there's a question that comes up from that media about the extent to which public opinion and indeed political opinion ends up being, or can end up being, almost completely dominated by what will the media do. But that's not a small concern to have if you're a government. And it's not like Johnson government needed to worry about a sort of imminent election or anything like Donald Trump in America. They made that decision having just won a landslide only a couple of months earlier. And you could see in Boris Johnson's reaction, the speech where he announced the first measures, how incredibly reluctant he was to do this, and that he couldn't believe that a sort of liberal in the true sense, conservative prime minister was having to announce this. But then, of course, we almost lost the prime minister. I mean, it was a 50-50 thing, as I understand it, when he was in intensive care. And that in itself has been, I think, a pretty salutary thing to have happened. I mean, we in this country, we were in a very perilous situation there for a bit.
I don't want to belabor this point too much, but it does remind me of a question that I got from one of the Civitas members, who was asking about, this is from Dr. Bruce Party, who's a law professor at Queen's University. And he said that you've been having a public spat with Peter Hitchens about the pandemic. And he provided a fairly lengthy quote here where Peter is basically just saying that, I see my country in danger of grave and lasting threats to its freedom and prosperity, a fear of future of overmighty officials and police displaying an unbridled insolence of office, dead political consensus combined with confiscatory taxes, shriveled savings and pensions, lower wages, living standards, ... If Douglas wants to support this idiocy, he should say so. If he's against it, he should say so. So just wondering if you could respond to that.
We haven't actually had a public spat. I've known Peter for many years. He is an enormously disputatious man, and I have a lot of admiration for him. And I simply remarked in a column in The Spectator in passing that I admired Peter for coming out so completely against the government's policy. but said, I don't know if Peter is right or wrong, which is correct. I don't. Incidentally, I don't think he knows or can know whether he's right or not. I particularly don't know whether Peter's right or wrong because I've never known him to write about this subject before or to have thought about it or considered it at any length or in any depth. And one of the things that has guided my own writing and thinking over the years is to try very hard not to speak or think out loud about things you haven't thought about very much. And, I think that the importance of dissident society is exceptionally important. And in my column was I admired Peter for being one figure, a disputatious figure who takes to the battle. Peter doesn't turns out he doesn't really take compliments well, and was furious that I didn't simply agree with him, but I don't because I can't. It's possible that all of our governments have been wrong and Peter is right, but I wouldn't bet on it. And as I say, I hold to my belief that you've got to have very, very good amount of knowledge and expertise to claim that the incredibly careful calibration that all of our governments are having to make is in fact not that careful a question. It's not that difficult. In fact, it's incredibly easy and straightforward. And it's contrary to what they're doing. I just don't have the confidence that Peter is that. And so that's why I say.
That's fair enough. So there is still so much uncertainty around this virus. One thing that's becoming a little more clear, Douglas, and you wrote about this in the UK Sun this morning, was about the role that China has played, either in sort of hiding early information about the virus to allow it to become a global problem, or perhaps even the fact that it may have leaked from a virology lab in the same city of Wuhan. So what do you think the short-term and the long-term ramifications will be for China and its relationship with the West?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously the thing that is, if we have managed to duck the worst case scenario in the pandemic, obviously now we face what could, in the long run, seem to be an even worse scenario, which is our economic immiseration. I would say that, first of all, yes, the piece I wrote this morning about this was that, firstly, we need to know as soon as possible exactly what has happened. And when you're in the middle of the mortem, it's probably not worth doing the post-mortem. But we ought to do the post-mortem as soon as possible on this. I think that the President Trump's remarks on Friday or Thursday night, where he raised the question of whether the lab in Wuhan had actually been, where the virus had come from. And this, by the way, had been speculated about. I'd spoken to officials in America about this quite early on in the crisis. This was something that all sorts of experts and others are speculating on early on, that it seemed strange that it had come from the area where this particular laboratory is. And it seems perfectly plausible that the Chinese authorities took the, as it were, international embarrassment of the wet market story as being the acceptable story compared to it actually coming out of a laboratory in their country. And then, but either way you do that, and then, by the way, there's a question of how deliberate or otherwise it was, and that's the bit that's obviously going to be hardest to work out, but in many ways will be most important. Whatever the origin of the virus, one thing we do know very, very clearly now is the beginnings of the knowledge of the extent to which the Chinese authorities are responsible not just for this emerging, which is a bit of the question, as I say, that's open, but the almost irrefutable point at this stage, which is that they covered up what was happening, they lied, they prevaricated, they did much more that meant that they turned a local problem into a global nightmare. And this, of course, as we all know, I mean, this is the common behavior in totalitarian societies. Anyone who's watched the the amazing Netflix series on the nuclear meltdown in Soviet Russia at Chernobyl will know this, that totalitarian societies act in certain ways when disasters occur. And this particular disaster of the virus, the Chinese Communist Party has acted in exactly the normal way, which is to think that its own survival, own PR image, own self-image is what's most important to protect, rather than trying to do everything to be open and honest and let the world know what's coming to them. And I think that there's absolutely everything has to be on the table in terms of exacting a price that the Chinese Communist Party has to pay. It cannot simply have burnt down the world economy and then, offer us a watering can afterwards, which is frankly the sight of like Huawei embossed boxes of masks being handed to Dutch officials, and as if that'll do. It's an incredibly serious situation, this, and a geopolitical problem for us, because too many of our countries have been too reliant on China for too long. Too many of our officials have been able to enrich themselves by their relationships with Chinese companies and others. So I think that a real reckoning has to occur after this.
Well, one of the examples that was in that article you had was a German newspaper demanding reparations from China, and the Chinese reaction was sort of to turn things around and say that the German paper was promoting discrimination and bigotry against Chinese people. Yeah. I think that's such an important distinction. In Canada, there's a newspaper called the Epoch Times. It's run by Chinese dissidents from the Falun Gong community. And they put out sort of a full page spread blaming the Chinese Communist Party for the pandemic. And they mailed it out, free copies were mailed out to Canadians across the country. Well, the CBC, the state broadcaster in Canada, wrote up sort of a hit piece, an article calling, get this, calling the Epoch Times racist and saying that they were pushing disinformation. But the paper itself is run by Chinese dissidents. It's expanded a bit beyond that now, but the owner and the origin of the paper, and everything in the stories was quite factual and fair. And so to see Canada state broadcasters sort of using the Chinese line that if you criticize the Communist Party, it's because you're motivated by some kind of racism or bad intentions.
I mean, it's so pathetic, isn't it? I mean, just so pathetic. A line of mine that occasionally gets quoted is, I said somewhere once that, in societies like ours, when the barbarians are at the gates, we'll be debating what gender pronouns they'll want. And I just think it's contemptible. And the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party in response is utterly typical. And the thing that so many idiots in our societies don't get is that their stupidity is exactly what totalitarian governments like that are after. If the Chinese Communist Party can say that Bild, the German paper you refer to, which did this very impressive spread the other day and the demand for reparations, global reparations, actions. If the Chinese Communist Party attacks Bild for racism, it isn't because it thinks that Bild is being racist. It's because it knows that allegation matters in our societies. It matters in Germany, like it matters in Britain, it matters in Canada. We're worried about that. The idea that the Chinese Communist Party cares a damn about discrimination anywhere in the world, let alone in Germany, is a fantastical idea. So the thing in this is always, I say that we've got to work out when we're being played and when we're being used. And anyone who falls for this stuff is being played, they're being used, they're the dolt.
And I think you could certainly say that the CBC is guilty of that in many ways. I just want to pick up on this idea of sort of weaponizing accusations of racism, because it's not just authoritarian regimes that do it, Douglas. I think your book, The Strange Death of Europe, really touched on some topics that, if you try to zero in on criticizing sort of maybe cultural issues that might come from, people immigrating from Syria, say, that they bring with them, whether it be, the treatment towards women, treatment towards Jews, treatment towards gays. The reaction and sort of the impulse is to say, well, if you're criticizing these things about this person, it's really because you must hate Syrians, or you must hate Muslims, or you must be a hateful, bigoted person. And so how has that? I know Strange Death of Europe came out 4 years ago now, and a lot of things have changed in the world. But how do you think that sort of came about, that idea that you can't criticize cultural differences in people without getting that accusation of being called a racist?
Well, I mean, to steel man the argument, as it were, the opposite of straw manning something, to steel man it is that everyone is capable of bigotry, and that bigotry it exists in all societies, it exists in our societies, and therefore to be a good person and to pursue a good life would be to say, be an anti-racist and be an anti-sexist and anti-homophobe and a few more things, and that makes you good in the eyes of your peers and contemporaries. That's the basis for it. I think that there's a misunderstanding at the origin of that, which is that it is true that bigotry exists in all societies, and it can exist in all people. It doesn't, of course, exist simply in some people and not in others. It's not like there are the children of light and the children of darkness. And like one of the extraordinary things is this sort of Manichaean interpretation of our species. And of course, if you say to people, which one would you like to be, on the side of the goodies or the side of the baddies? A lot of people say, I'd love to be on the side of the good guys. And it's not much more complex than that for a lot of sort of warriors on this. I think, however, that what's happened is we've been in a version of something similar to what was known as Moynihan's Law. You may remember the late American Democrat Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He, among other things, a former American ambassador in the 1970s, he had something known as Moynihan's Law, where he pointed out that claims of human rights violations occur in exactly inverse proportion to human rights violations. That is, the countries where you hear about the most are the countries where they happen the least. Because the countries in which they happen the most, you don't hear about them. We don't get to hear what level of transphobia exists in North Korea. There's a good reason for that. We don't get to hear, what studies there have been of whether or not racism in China is up or down this year. How many hate crimes have there been in China this year? We don't know the figures. A simple person, with no particularly malevolent intent, may well, as a consequence, grow up thinking that, it's countries like Canada and Britain that are the really bigoted countries. And it's the rest of the world which lives in this sort of Edenic, non-human rights violating, rights respecting paradise. Now, I do think this is something similar that's been going on. Our societies spend all of our time talking about bigotry and prejudice and much more. And I haven't spent that much time in Canada, but I've been there a few times, and I don't see Gestalt-like figures, parading the streets, waiting to beat up minorities of any kind. I've always found your average Canadian pretty easy to get along with, and I think there's something really perverse in this. It just has to be pointed out that a fair estimation of our societies has not occurred in recent years, and that my shortcut, shoot down to that is to simply to point out to people, in the 1930s and 40s, Jews weren't trying to break into Nazi Germany. You know, there weren't, but and others from around the world desperate to make it to Munich. There's a reason why our countries are attractive. There's a reason why the world wants to come here, and it's definitely the opposite of because we're bigoted, racist, etc. So I wrote about that in The Strange Death of Europe on the issues of race and culture and identity, and then extended that in The Madness of Crowds into all of the other, the landmines that I had previously gone upon.
It does seem like it's been created intentionally, though, to stop conversation. Like if you have genuine concerns about bringing in tens of thousands of people from a community that doesn't have a fundamental respect for women, doesn't have fundamental respect for religious minorities and ethnic minorities and sexual minorities, but instead of having that conversation, we're just sort of slapped with this accusation that does sort of create a chill in society.
Yeah,
and
of course it creates a chill. It's about the most chilling thing, because it's the most damaging non-criminal thing you can be accused of, and on occasions, as we all know, actually treads into being criminal matter. At least it's treated in the court system in all our countries increasingly as such. So yes, it's about as chilling as you can get, and the problem is that it means that dishonest actors can get away with too much. Roger Kimball, who edits the New Criterion magazine in New York, I think is the person who first came up with the idea that I very much admire, that you will not be able to write this until, for instance, the cost of making a frivolous and erroneous accusation of racism against somebody carries a societal let's say a societal punishment, a social punishment, a social degradation similar to that which would be put at somebody's feet if it turned out they were a racist. So the problem is that it's a free shot. You say somebody's a racist or a homophobe or a misogynist or all of the above, because they often come as a team these days, as accusations, and you throw these at somebody, and if the person says, and this happens all the time, as we know, the person says, "Hang on," as in pop times cases, hang on, how can I be a racist? Please. Well, the person making the accusation just puts away. It doesn't seem to have any impact even on their day, let alone their lives. So it's a free shot, and that's what our societies have to address. Why haven't we, by this point, made there be a societal cost for lying about people and defaming people? And it shouldn't be a matter for the courts in most cases, I think, apart from the cases of absolutely egregious libel and slander. But it should be something that our societies are better at policing. There's that totally fake, frivolous person who just goes around trying to make a living by claiming everyone else is a bigot. That, don't listen to that person. That should be very normal.
Yeah, and if anything, you say that they have no ramifications against them. It's not even that. As you point out, in Madness of Crowds, they get celebrated for it. In a lot of ways, there's social status in claiming victimhood and claiming that you have been the victim of some kind of a hate act or discrimination, and sort of that's a way that they gain some social status. I wanted to ask you about this, just shifting, I guess, towards Madness of Crowds. So there's a new Netflix show that my husband and I have been watching. It's about the 1990s Chicago Bulls basketball team and Michael Jordan, and it's called The Last Dance. It's really excellent. Anyways, we're watching this sort of look into the 1990s, and the 1990s just seem so. It seems so far away, so far ago, and such a sort of peaceful, idyllic society. The biggest things that people were concerned about and looking at were, the basketball team and these huge stars that were created and these big brands. Even the biggest scandal in the White House was a supposed affair with an intern. really small potatoes compared to the kind of things that we're dealing with. So, looking back at the 1990s, it almost seemed like some of the major issues that we're dealing with today and that we started dealing with around 2015, 2016, those issues were like solved. They were like a thing of the past. Even the way that Michael Jordan talked about how he had experienced some racism, but that was in the past and that was in the South, and now it was different, and that kind of thing. It seemed like somehow, in that era, we felt like we had moved beyond some of these major issues. And then, as you address in Mad List of Crowds, by 2015, 2016, 2017, we were right in the midst of it. And so much so that the rules are constantly changing, and every day there are new rules. So things that were okay yesterday are no longer okay now. So how do we get to that situation where it seemed like we'd moved past everything, and now all of a sudden everything's coming back, and it's coming back way worse than ever before?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I use the analogy of it being on the rights issues, like seeing a train drawing into the station, that is its desired destination, only to suddenly get a head of steam and go shooting off down the tracks, off the tracks, and scattering people in its wake. There has been racism in the past. I don't doubt there is racism today, but there's never been less of it than there is in modern Canada or modern Britain. So why is it presented as if it's never been worse? There has been sexism in the past. Women were prevented from doing all sorts of things in their lives in the past. There has been homophobia in the past, of course. But why do we hear now about our countries being so damn bigoted at the point at which they've never been less bigoted on the question? And I think that the truth is, I'll watch that Netflix series. I thought there wasn't a Netflix series that I hadn't seen, so I'm delighted here. There is.
It's brand new. I think it just came out last week.
But I think that one thing that has caused this is something that has happened in our lifetimes. I think in the lifetimes of everyone that's with us today, is something very curious that isn't raised often enough, and it is this. It is the emergence of the idea that somebody who has suffered is more worthy of listening to than somebody who has not. And again, to steelman this, it's not totally untrue in certain circumstances. So, for instance, it is true that when Solzhenitsyn came out of Russia, we wanted to hear from him, not just because he was a great writer, but because he was a man who had suffered and knew firsthand what he was speaking about. So there is something in it, but it isn't infinite, and it doesn't exist all the way down to the most minute grievance. Now, there's a second thing which is worth pointing out, which is that the left in most of our countries has, for a long time now, made a particular mistake, which is the mistake of thinking that when somebody suffers, they become good. My colleague, journalist in the UK and Spectator and elsewhere, Nick Cohen, who's very much of the political left, pointed this out 15 years ago in his book, What's Left? Why did the left always think, for instance, that peoples who had suffered under a terrible government, under the next government, would be wonderful people because they'd suffered? So, I mean, they wouldn't be, corrupt, or they wouldn't do it again. They wouldn't be violent themselves towards anybody, and so on and so forth. There's this erroneous idea that suffering brings insight, which it does to some people, but not to everybody, and that being a victim means you should be listened to. Now, the problem is that this means that there has been a stampede toward victimhood, and I think I can probably say this with some, we don't know each other very well, but we know each other a bit. And I think I can say with some certainty that in our lives, we were probably both, and many other people here were brought up, I believe, when you suffered, you didn't go on about it. Now, what was one reason? In Britain, there was a phrase, mustn't grumble. I can't think when the last time was that I heard that phrase. In fact, it's the least likely phrase to hear these days. How are you? Oh, mustn't grumble. No, national sport is grumbling. And the reason I mention this is because the idea that we were, I think, brought up with was, among other things, you don't moan. You shouldn't assume your life is that much worse than anyone else. Because among other things, you don't know what the person you're speaking with and to has gone through today, or indeed in their lives. So, among other things, it's enormously presumptuous to present yourself as having suffered because somebody looked at you meanly once. You know, you might be speaking to somebody who was orphaned by the age of 15 or something. How the hell do you know what they've gone through? How the hell do any of us know how to evaluate their lives? And the conclusion that our societies have come to, which partly came from a philosophical ethic, partly came from a political ethic, and very significantly came from a religious ethic, was to admire quiet suffering, to admire people who suffered without expecting everybody to therefore pay attention to them. And this is absolutely crucial, is that we put an extremely high social status on heroism, which is the precise opposite of the thing that we have put the social status highest with today, which is somebody who can claim to have been a victim. And if you say our societal desire, our aspiration should be heroism, we celebrate heroes, we celebrate the heroic, then people will likely migrate toward that direction themselves. They may not have especially heroic lives, they won't all be celebrated or anything like that. But it means that you have a society which orients towards heroism. And our society, because we most reward victims, now orients itself towards victimhood, so that people in the luckiest society in history end up wishing to present themselves as if they're victims of something. And I think it's pathetic. I just sort of lampoon it, critique it, and sit it out otherwise. But I think it's a massive shift, and it's happened in our lifetimes. And by the way, if it's happened in our lifetimes, that means that it can go back in our lifetimes. So I'm not too pessimistic about it.
It's a really good point you raise. I remember also, one of the lessons that my parents would teach was it wasn't always a good idea to put voice to thought. So just because you're feeling down or you're having a bad day, if all of a sudden you want to talk about it, you want to hash it out, it makes you feel, somehow it could be therapeutic, but it could also make you feel much worse. And having this sort of group session where you're telling everyone all your victimhoods and you want to be able to speak your truth, whatever that means, it somehow degrades the entire level of discourse. Douglas, I wanted to ask you, I'll ask you sort of my last question and then we can move into the group discussion, because I know there's a lot of people who want to get questions to you. But both of your latest two books and your big books focus on the theme of identity. And one of the things, in sort of diverse pluralistic societies like Canada, the United States, to some extent the United Kingdom, our identity is really based first and foremost, I mean, everyone has their own individual identity based on gender and all those kind of things. But we were united in our identity as Canadians. Being a Canadian meant something. It wasn't a specific definition, because in Canada, we have French Catholics, we have English Protestants, we have people from all different kinds of backgrounds. So the identity wasn't based on these sort of intersectional grids, but it was really just, we're Canadian, we're here, we've built this society together, and it did mean something. And now we have the breaking up of identities into intersectionality. Do you think the original identity of being Canadian or being American or being a Brit, but not necessarily based on your personal qualities like race and gender and those things, do you think there's value and we can ever get back to that, to being united based on a broader identity? Or do you think now that we've come down this path where we've chopped ourselves up into these little mini groups, that going back to that national identity is going to be sort of too far gone?
Well, look at the last few weeks. Whatever your views on it, did you honestly think in your lifetime you were going to hear Justin Trudeau announce the closing of Canada's borders? Did you honestly think that you would see the EU, which at least was pretending not to be a protectionist bloc, and protectionist within the bloc from country to country, would, for instance, that we would see the German and French governments ban the export of masks to Italy at the point in the crisis when Italy was hit at the worst, and France and Germany had not yet reached anything like that. Within the EU, I can't stress this enough. I mean, the EU is, the whole thing with it now is to pretend that national borders don't exist. And that is why I and many others, in fact, the majority in my country, voted to leave the EU, because we do believe in the nation state as the most reasonable, the best way to organize and to cohere a society and an economy and much more. But, just look at that in recent weeks. The upsurge, by the way, in Euroscepticism, EU skepticism in Italy, you can guess what the polls have shown in recent weeks since that. But it's a demonstration of what some of us argued all along, which is that the nation state exists for us. It's a natural thing. It is to an extent a construct, of course, like everything, but it's a perfectly reasonable and natural way to cohere, to organize, and much more. And what has happened, again, this has happened in our lifetimes, is the presumption that national identity is bad because it leads to nationalism, and nationalism leads to war. It's a very simplistic, but in a way a deep thought, because it's trying to contend with the 20th century. It's doing so in an incredibly basic way. It's taking among things a very easy to take lesson that only partly explains, only very, very partly explains what happened in the last century. But it says, okay, nationalism leads to this, therefore. And as I've pointed out many times, everything can go wrong. Everything can go wrong. Love caused the Trojan Wars. We don't try to ban love or say that love should be prevented because it can lead to this awful war thing. Everything can go wrong. Now, the interesting thing is we actually know an awful lot now about where and when and how nationalism goes wrong. We know it was studying Germany in the 20th century, among many other things. But we've had a lot more knowledge of that from a much wider array of countries and places. So we're pretty knowledgeable about where nationalism goes wrong. But the idea that because it can go wrong, you should try to degrade national identity and give people these other identities is to make so many, is to commit so many, as I've said, I think in The Strange Death of Europe, before the wars of nation states racked Europe, before the Treaty of Westphalia, we had the wars of religion that racked Europe. What are you going to do? Try to ban religion? As I say, everything can go wrong. I think that it's very clear that all the rights movements of the last century have all gone badly wrong in their last phase, what I critique in The Madness of Crafts. So they've gone wrong. Women's rights starts off as a great argument, and it ends up going to this horrible, man-hating, effectively human-hating fourth wave phase. Gay rights, I think, starts off as a very good, very reasonable thing. They just treat us like everybody else, and then ends up in this last phase being this horrible and vindictive, thing that backs up, Thomas Sowell, I think it was, said, wasn't it? Every rights battle starts, as something, with a cause, and ends up, ends up as a business, and it finishes as a racket. And that's what all these things are. So these things go wrong. And one other point, if I may, on that, which is, I think it's very interesting that, we live in an era where we search for meaning as much as ever, but there are the things we are being offered to find meaning in are very poor simulacrums of past the same thing. I think that inviting people to find meaning in their chromosomes, or meaning in their sexual orientation, or meaning in the chance of what race you're born, what your skin color is apart from anything else a human demeaning idea, because it suggests that that's sort of all we are. That all we are is our chromosomes or our sexual orientation or our skin color. And I don't think that is the case. I think it's, in all of these cases, the least interesting thing about anybody. And it's the place where you start from. And so that's one of the many things we've got wrong. But again, I'm optimistic on those ones. There's an awful lot of things I can pessimist away on, but I think these ones we'll see coming back. And as I say, just in recent weeks, we've seen an example of that. When a massive global pandemic emerged, it wasn't like the LGBT community went one way in response and heterosexuals went another. It wasn't like the men and the women decided to do different things. It isn't like within our countries, the Korean community in Canada decided to do one thing, and the Japanese community in Canada, and of course not. Canada acted as Canada, Britain acted as Britain. That shows an awful lot of energy and meaning, and therefore something right in the concept of the nation in the first place.
It's a really good point. Sometimes, when I was reading Madness of Crowds, it kind of started to think, these are all a result of just everyone's living such a great, prosperous, peaceful life. We've run out of, that it's the end of history to go back to Francis Fukuyama's idea. But, there's nothing left to quarrel about. So let's just invent all of these different grievances, and maybe things have changed now that we won't go back to those. We do have a couple of hands up that we're going to get to. First, I did want to read an email question that I got from John Van Heike, who's a professor at the University of Lethbridge. He says, Douglas, I enjoyed your books very much. Your Madness of Crowd includes a fine analysis of how precariously defined each of the identities is, which raises questions as to how far identity politics can last. Even so, the Rainbow Coalition, in quotes, seems pretty enduring. What do you think accounts for that? Is it simply a matter of shared hatred for the bourgeoisie heteronormativity, that's in quotes as well, or whatever you call it? Or are the Rainbow Coalition members united more by shared hatred, or is it a shared friendship?
I think it's, thank you for the question. I think it's shared hatred in a way, but it's a hatred that people are taught into. You have to be taught into this stuff. I think it's one of the reasons why the modern universities in all of our countries have so much to answer for, where people go away to university and learn new grievances to adopt and become more stupid on a range of issues. I mean, there was a very fine example the other week when a young woman who turns out to be teaches part-time at Oxford Brookes University and teaches in some very minor capacity at Oxford University, wrote a piece, I think published on the left-wing clickbait site, the Huffington Post, saying that she hoped that her university, which she said was Oxford University, which I stress wasn't quite true, but she said that she hoped her university, Oxford University, didn't find the vaccine for the COVID virus, because if it did, she knew it would be used as part of the nationalistic narrative of the Boris Johnson government. And he said, you've really got to be educated into that kind of stupidity to wish that you don't find a global pandemic virus a cure for it, because it would bring pride to your society and to your country, and anything to stop that. I pointed out because not only is it ludicrous, but it's a very unnatural response to that. And it goes back to the point you just made before, which is that it's a product of times being too good, that you don't have real grievances, and so you've got to make some up. I think that'll be an interesting thing to see, by the way, in the months and years ahead. Now that we've all had a little whiff, at least, some people a lot more, of what actual grievances one might have. we might have less for the people who made up grievances. So yes, I mean, I think it's sort of something might reassert itself in that, but I just a very quick thing. Yes, within each identity group, I point out it's deeply unstable in itself, and between each other, there's almost nothing they have in common. I mean, LGBT doesn't even get along. It's not even a thing. The L's and the G's don't get along. They're very suspicious of the B's, and they don't like the T's in a lot of cases. And so it says, you know, and I mean, you can do that on every single one of them. You know, ethnic minority communities. What do they think about this? Oh yeah. Well, there's one view that ethnic minority communities have. Wow. You know,
Yeah, it's certainly news to them. I even get resentful during election campaigns when they do discussions on women's issues, because you know I never really seem to care about the supposed women's issues that I'm supposed to care about. We have a question from Dr. Roy Epen. Dr. Roy, let's promote you to a panelist and give you the floor. The floor is yours, Dr. Roy.
Oh, hi, Mr. Murray. I met you in Montreal at the Mark Stein event in Montreal.
with Mark Stein, of course. Yeah, of course. Hi, nice to see you again.
So I love all of what you write, and I always want to thank you again for your defense of Sir Roger Scruton, who has also been at one of our Civitas events. A wonderful, wonderful man, and was taken apart 2 years before he died for idiocy. Is there any way that we can counteract this ability to destroy people for nothing after years and years of great books and thought?
That's a very good question. I've thought about this a lot because, yes, you probably know I was sort of much caught up in all of that. This was, for anyone who didn't follow it, this was just a year before his death in January. Roger Scruton, who I think it was fair to say was our greatest living philosopher, certainly the person I respected most in the field, and who I think was most widely appreciated and indeed loved, and who had the most extraordinary range. I mean, it's one important thing, isn't it, that not only could he write on politics and political philosophy, but also on aesthetics, on architecture, on music, on all the things that make life worth living, as well as the meaning of life itself and much more. He was taken apart by an interviewer from the New Statesman magazine, the left-wing magazine, which lied about him and misquoted him and deliberately misquoted him, and took remarks and put in remarks that he didn't make, and much more. It's a total hatchet job. And I exposed this fact, and unfortunately, in a demonstration of how degraded our press has become, the journalist in question remains in the employment of the New Statesman. Now, I thought there was something to learn from that whole episode. It's a very painful thing in a way for me, because Roger was a very close friend, and I knew that he hadn't said what this journalist said he had said. I knew it because I'd known Roger for years, and I just knew that, you know, he didn't go on anti-Chinese people rants, or, you know, he wasn't some sort of coarse bigot, you know. He was an incredibly refined, very, very thoughtful and caring person, and a brilliant mind. And I knew he hadn't said it, and that's why I immediately put up a defense of him, and then found out the facts and exposed the fact that he hadn't said it. But the worrying thing to me was that all of these Conservative MPs, among others, immediately said, you know, drop him, he's toast, he's a liability, as if Sir Roger Scruton was so much excess baggage. And the government in Britain, the Conservative government of Theresa May, which had appointed him to a non-paid position, fired him within 3 or 4 hours of this hack's made-up quotes coming out. Several things were interesting to me, and I'll do them very quickly. The first is, I think it's the first time, my editor and colleague at The Spectator, Fraser Nelson, made this point. I think it's one of the first times that a price has been paid by people for joining a Twitter mob. So several Conservative MPs who joined the Twitter mob very early, thinking that would win them brownie points, actually lost out as a result. One, for instance, was somebody who aspires to be a leader of the Conservative Party one day or someday, and he had no idea what he was doing. He just was being weak, and he actually his reputation among party members and others suffered enormously because of this, because people thought, no, that's not right. And so that's one of the first things. I think the largest lesson that I took from it is just a really crucial one, which I would like people everywhere to sort of bear in mind and pass on. It's a very simple one, which is just always stick up for your mates, and particularly always stick up for your mates when you know they're being lied about. And the really interesting thing in our time with this sort of Torquemada-like tendency that has existed in recent years, the really interesting thing to me is not that people fallaciously make arguments against people in order to demonize them. It's the fact that the people near the person being demonized don't stand up more. I mean, that's the case with people like Brett Weinstein in the US, who I write about in The Madness of Crowds, a professor at a college in Portland, in Oregon, who, when he's a left-wing, Bernie-supporting, lifelong Democrat. And when he was accused of racism for something that was absolutely not racist, none of his colleagues of decades stood up for him publicly, not one. And that's where the societal, embarrassment, I think, exists. I think people should stand up for their friends, particularly when they know that they are being lied about. And they should say, no, you're not getting away with that. We know that this is not a fair estimation of this person because we know them. And I think we can all do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Roy. Douglas, there was a question emailed in about Sir Roger Scruton, so I'll ask that as well, just while we're on the topic. This is from Jack Wright. He says that Sir Scruton favorably reviewed The Madness of Crowds, was a friend of yours. How would you have placed the sense of diversity you discuss in your books into his philosophy of conservatism?
Yes, Roger had a very long, very thoughtful review of The Madness of Crowds. I don't think there was very much water between us. In fact, I spoke to Roger quite a lot when I was thinking about The Madness of Crowds. He was always one of the people that a certain number of people I always sound out when I'm thinking about things and new ideas. And we didn't have 100% alignment on some of these issues. But we had a fair amount, I thought, the vast majority, of course. I think, by the way, I don't want to be presumptuous about it, I think that Roger's own thinking about some of these things had changed a little bit over the years. Roger had a lovely phrase he used to use, that he said that sometimes it seemed to him the role of conservatives was to fight the next battle they knew they were going to lose. And of course, one thing that comes from that is you leave behind, like a sort of terrible flotsam, a load of things you did on all of the things you were fighting when they came round in the past. And Roger was for many decades, the foremost conservative figure on a whole range of things, saying slow down or stop. And always did so in these, as a mutual friend, as a philosopher said, used to do so in pieces, particularly when he was writing in the Times of London in the 1980s, pieces that were effectively incredibly tightly packed ideological pipe bombs. Every sentence would attack a fundamental presumption of the liberal society of the kind that Britain and other countries had become. So yes, he was also, he was great friends with a number of the people and was enormously influenced by and influenced a number of major figures who've been on the front lines of each of these issues. Christina Hoff Sommers, for instance, a remarkable academic and writer now at the American Enterprise Institute, was a long friend of Roger's, and her thinking on feminism was much influenced by him, and he was influenced by her. So it's a huge presence and a huge loss.
Great. Yeah, and I mean, my personal thoughts on it is, it seems that there's a new movement. I know Orrin Cass wrote a book called The Once and Future Worker, and they launched a movement called the American Compass. And the idea is that relying on the sort of libertarian, laissez-faire economic structure is limited, and that we need to present something more for conservatism. And I think that sort of goes in line with Sir Roger Scruton's idea that there needs to be more to conservatism as opposed to just free markets.
But it's a very, very important point, and there are more people now catching on to this, and I think that Roger was not alone, but one of very few people in recent decades making this point from the right. I think that, yes, my observation has been that in recent decades, in particular, young people who've basically been of the right say they're libertarian because they sort of want to get away with it somehow, but that it has seeped into being the case that that the only thing conservatives know how to argue is the economy, you know. And that's very dangerous, among other things, because when the economy goes wrong under conservative government, whether it's the government's fault or not, you know, you look like the one thing people could trust you with. You can't be trusted with either. And I do think that one of the great challenges for the political right, particularly after Scruton's passing and others, is to keep hold of and develop thinking on all of these things. It seems appalling to me that, for instance, a conservative government would just wave through the destruction of the countryside for economic reasons, or allow the building of incredibly hideous buildings in the center of your cities, you know, and say, oh, well, it brings in money. That doesn't seem to me a conservative argument. It's a very narrow type of free marketeer argument. But anyhow, but yes, it's a very important thing to consider.
Great. Let's go to some of these hands that are up. Let's go to Paige Monroe. You have a question, so we'll promote you up to panelist. And Paige, the floor is yours.
Hi, Douglas. Thank you very much for your participation this morning. I just wondered, so I'm sure you're aware that Dr. Jordan Peterson has sort of been thrown into the fire because of his recent health and mental health struggles. I just wondered what you would say to all these rather disgusting people on Twitter who say that, you know, oh, he's finally got what he deserves because of all of his comments.
It's a very good question, Paige. I know Jordan a bit. I'm very proud to call him a friend, and yeah, I mean, he and his family have had a hell of a year, and my view is that, among other things, Jordan carried an awful lot of burden in the last few years, and he carried it with exceptional grace and fortitude and courage. And what I'm really thinking of is the fact that, again, it slightly goes back to Dr. Roy's comment, is that, in question, is that we are in this situation in our societies where things that majorities, I would argue, of people in our societies know to be true are either said by nobody or are said by one or two people who, as a result, become the target of a very vociferous and noisy minority. And nobody has that been the case with more in recent years than with Jordan. I thought a lot throughout that period that he was carrying an incredible burden in the fact that, I mean, let me give you one example, is that if you are known to be a truth teller on one issue, you will be asked about other issues, and you'll develop a truth-telling tendency in those as well. And all your opponents need is for you to slip up once, for you to once say the wrong word or express the wrong wording even, or, I don't know, be human in a way, like lose your temper or tell someone to shut up, or, you know, things that we're all fallible humans, we can all do. And if you're in the position that Jordan was in, they were waiting for him to slip up at any moment. And he never did, because he isn't the person they want to portray him as. You know, the people who like to present him as if he is this sort of fantasy figure of their imaginations, who this sort of misogynistic, you know, homophobic, racist, blah, 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 you know, all of the usual curse terms, the magic spell terms. He isn't that, and they tried everything, and they lied about him, and they misrepresented him, just like they did with Roger, and they pretended he said things he hadn't said, and they pretended that when they couldn't get him on that, they did that trick that they do now, which is say, he may not have used the word, but he did a dog whistle.
He's a whistle for white supremacy or something.
Exactly. And I love this one because, of course, if you hear the whistle, you're the dog. There aren't people gifted to interpret words on behalf of the dog community or whatever. I mean, it's an extraordinarily presumptuous thing. I mean, just think about it for a second. These are people who pretend that although people don't use words or phrases that they want to accuse them of, the fact they haven't used those words or phrases is evidence that they're using them secretly at a special sonar level.
Yes.
And they couldn't even get him on that because, again, because that's not him. That's not the case. So he carried an incredible burden. I think he's an extraordinary man. And I have seen firsthand from doing events with him and, you know, and meeting people and speaking with people afterwards, I've seen firsthand what an impact he's had on so many lives, particularly the lives of young people and of every background and, you know, and much more. And he has brought an enormous amount of purpose and meaning to a lot of people's lives in a way I think is unparalleled, actually. I can't think of another public intellectual who's had a similar impact. And a society, I said this a while ago about him in a piece trying to stand up for him when the mob was coming for him. I said, a society that was serious would say, even if it opposed what he said, would say, there must be something in this, because thousands of young people are turning out to hear this person speak. So even if we don't agree with his conclusions, even if we don't agree with the landscape he's laid out as being an accurate, you know, reflection of our society, there must be something he's touching which it would be worth finding out about and possibly addressing ourselves. And I'm so struck that Jordan's critics have almost never done that. They've almost never done that. And, you know, I just wish him well. We could do with him back and up and well, but he must do so as when he can, and you know, but he's done an incredible amount, and just all our thoughts, I think, are with him and his family.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Peja. It was a great question. And I'm going to go to Dr. Scott Mason next, because I think his question is related to the conversation that we're on right now. So we'll promote Dr. Mason to the floor, and the floor is yours.
So I was very intrigued by what you said. Thank you very much, Douglas. And I wanted to engage on various things, but the last thing that you mentioned about Sir Roger Scruton and Tom Flanagan getting defenestrated by their own conservative parties. This is something that we've seen happen to conservative figures repeatedly over the years. Not that they've done anything wrong, but simply that they were targeted for removal because of something that they allegedly said and may not even have said, but you mentioned there was a lack of solidarity or principle or courage on behalf of their own contemporaries. And even when they were standard bearers like this, the same thing would apply to Jordan Peterson that you just mentioned as well. My question is the reason why that is that even those that call themselves conservatives aren't really conservatives in anything other than what you just said, economic issues, but they don't really have a coherent philosophy or a view of what human nature actually is. And that effectively, that means that they agree with the political left that human nature is something that we construct. And so there is no fundamental principle that underlies anything for that matter. There's nothing that they regard as self-evident, and therefore there's nothing that can be proved. So the charge is enough to bring somebody down. There's nothing to defend anymore.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I do think that there are fundamental misunderstandings, including the one you just mentioned of an understanding of human nature, or a misunderstanding of human nature, which I think, yes, has been shared by many people on the right as well as the left. I mean, I'm amazed by the number of presumptions that I find people who call themselves conservatives and often elected to be conservatives actually have, including ones that I mean, no conservative should believe, such as, you know, the possibility of, well, among other things, the idea that we're better than our ancestors because we live after them. You know, I mean, it's a sort of very basic presumption, which you routinely find people who identify as being on the right holding, and perfectibility and many other things. I think, though, if I can say so, it might be that it's a tactical issue that causes this. And let me just explain very briefly, if I may, what I mean by this. I think it's something tactical because the perception, if somebody on the right errs, is that they've gone into a totally unacceptable and reprehensible place. Whereas somebody on the left who errs is still of the left. Now, what I mean by this is that I once said this in a conversation with Jordan, that I think that it's because of an understanding of politics which we've imbibed pretty much since the 40s. Is this is a political centre, and this is the right, and this is the left. This is the political centre. You can be 1 degree here, so you can be for like lower taxes, and you're there. You could be, you know, you could be a sort of free marketeer economic, you know, conservatism, but there is fascism.
Yeah.
Or at least, let me put it like this: you go there, and then you go down. You're fascism. And if that's still the political centre and you're of the political left, you go to like slightly higher taxes, higher welfare spending, appropriation of wealth, appropriation of property. There's sort of, it goes along all the way, and you never get to the gulag. And I find this to be one of the most interesting causes of the thing that has happened in all of our lifetimes, of there being this perception of a vertiginous fall off to the right. It's why so many right-wing politicians describe themselves as centre-right, because they say centre-right in order to give the sort of signal that they're not right-wing, because right-wing is basically Hitler, and they don't want to be Hitler, and so they're centre-right. And the left, I mean, you know, it's not like they don't audition to be centre-left. There are people who are centre-left, obviously, but the point is not just that the form of solidarity exists on the political left, but that there isn't a perception that it falls off in this manner. And so when somebody on the left says something, I don't know, well, for instance, Diane Abbott, who's only just left the shadow cabinet here, who's a prominent Labour politician in the UK, you know, said some years ago that, you know, the Chairman Mao was one of her political heroes. And when asked why, she sort of said, well, he did an, you know, enormous amount for Chinese agriculture or something. I mean, it was just staggering. Now, if somebody said, if somebody was interviewed in Britain and I don't know, a Conservative Party politician said, who's your political hero? And said, well, I've always been rather fond of Mussolini, you know. And you go, what do you mean? And, you know, say, oh, well, he got the trains running on time. Or, you know, General Franco's my sort of guy. Why? Oh, he kept order in Spain, you know, or something like that. You'd say, it's over for you. It's over. My point is that there is this strange lack of synchronicity between the political sides. And I think that it causes this follow-on effect. And I've seen this with various journalists and writers over the years who have, strayed into the dangerous, topics of things. But the moment that they put one foot wrong, my colleague at The Spectator, Toby Young, was unbelievably libeled for turning up to a conference which was described by the political left as being a eugenicist conference. And because he sat at the back of a conference which had to do with IQ and things like that, all very dangerous stuff, but it was, at a university, he sat at the back of the room to write about the conference, and for being there was torn to shreds in the media and elsewhere, and everyone, got away with libeling him and saying Toby Young's clearly eugenicist and wants to kill the poor, and and all this sort of nonsense. But the point is what's interesting is people run away because they just think, if you are, again, that's the center, and I'm here, if you just go there, I've got to run, I've got to get out of here, or I'm adjacent, to use one of the favorite phrases at the time, in terms of the era, I'm adjacent to somebody who's gone into reprehensible territory. And I find it a fascinating thing, this.
But again, is it not because they fear that, so when they do get mobbed like that, is it not because, for the very reason that you just said, they feel like they are not standing on any firm, solid, broad-based ground, like the law of human nature, like natural law, those sorts of things. They don't believe that is there. They believe that they're just on the spectrum, the continuum of the left, and they just happen to be on the center of that, or a little bit further to the right, and there is a cliff, and that's what they themselves believe.
You're absolutely right. This is what I've just been describing is a crowd tactic.
Yeah.
It's
mobbing.
It's a mobbing. It's a self-preservation tactic in the midst of the mobbing. But at the point, it goes to what the point you just made is that yes, because if you have first principles, it doesn't matter if the mob comes for you.
Right.
In fact, it doesn't matter if the mob comes to the person beside you. You're absolutely right. This is what we saw in the Scruton affair. It's what we've seen in many cases. It is a lack of first principles that would make somebody stand firm.
Right.
And if you don't have that, then they just stampede like any zebra.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Great, thanks for that question. And let's go next to Kara Johnson, because I think her question's related, and then after that we'll get to Rahim Mohammed. So hang tight if you have your hand up, we're gonna get to everyone, but let's give the floor to Kara.
Hi, thanks for being with us. It's really nice to meet you.
Virtually meet you.
I've not read a ton of your work, but I have seen a fair amount of it over time. But I saw you on a podcast last fall, and what I was most impressed about in the context of identity politics and freedom of speech was your championing of truth, that truth matters and how much we suffer when we don't uphold the truth. But what I didn't hear from you was a definition of truth. So I would be very grateful if you could provide your context for speaking about the truth.
That's a nice, easy one.
Sorry, this is Civitas.
Well, I mean, definitionally, it's obviously the absence of error. I mean, now, of course, we get into what is error. Various things. The first is if it's to do with simply the observation of the world around us, we can tell what is true. At the very least, we can tell what is true in all of the experience we have and all the knowledge we have. We know that this color has always been agreed on to be this color, and this other color has always been agreed not to be that color. We know in science is obviously the easiest one. There are things we know to be the case, and when somebody claims them not to be the case, we can notice it. Now, of course, outside of the sciences, particularly humanities, it becomes harder because it's experiential terrain, among other things. But let's just stick with science for a moment. I mean, look at the way in which, but by the way, can I just answer this by way of a quick diversion on this, which is, one of the reasons why I ended up in Massive Crowds writing the last chapter on the trans issue was not only I think is very fascinating and hadn't been looked at properly and thoroughly and you know, with I think the sort of understanding of what is actually maybe what the questions are that it's necessary to ask and think about. One of the reasons I became interested in this issue, which is a very fringe issue and it doesn't really have any impact on my life, was that I noticed the number of people who were scientists, who I noticed couldn't do what was being asked of them. And then people I knew, particularly at universities who were scientists, saying to me in private, I can't do this. And when you dug down and literally see what it was you found, and somebody said this to me openly, said, Douglas, for the first time in my life, I'm being asked not to use the scientific method by my university. I can't do it. Now, that is very interesting, of course, because and I think that was what sort of got me interested in the trans one was, wow, scientists saying we're being asked to lie. And these are people with a very specific idea of what is true and what is not. Within their field, I should say, within their terrain. Then you see how much easier it is to befuddle people and confuse people when it's in the much more fluid nature of the non-scientific world. And so that's it's not a total answer to your question. We'd have to be here for days if we got to the fundamental, but I think that it's obviously, you know, the question of truth is one of the earliest and most complex philosophical questions. In a way, sometimes when I say truth, of course, I mean sometimes it's a shorthand for what maybe it's a better way of saying is the pursuit of truth. In that what troubles me about a whole range of things in our societies is not that I have the truth and other people do not, but I think that we should be searching for the truth, and certainly not immersing ourselves in error, cutting away error wherever we can in order to stand a better chance of getting to that which is true. And I think, again, it's one of the things that has changed somewhat in our lifetime, that isn't seen as, that the pursuit of truth is not seen currently in our societies as a thing with the nobility it should be endowed with. And I think that there are various reasons why that's the case. And one is that we have slipped for a long time into this very relativistic idea that that's because basically there isn't any such thing as truth in any realm. And that's why, and this, I mean, I know people sometimes think that people interested in ideas belabor the significance of ideas, but they do have this trickle-down effect. And in our society, most commonly, this is heard in the phrase, my truth. I'm simply living my truth. You go, oh, I see. You have your truth, I have my truth. You say tomato, I say tomato. And that's a fascinating thing, because it is the most popular version of, there is no such thing as true or untrue. There is simply what one feels oneself. So in a way, it's just anything that's opposed to that presumption.
Thank you. I do think that was the heart of my question, was objective truth or subjective truth, and where, you know, how do we really, the need for some kind of a basis to conduct dialogue. So I think what you covered was helpful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Great, thanks for the question, Kara. And let's move on to Rahim Mohammed. Rahim, let's promote you to panelist, and the floor is yours.
Hello, Candice. Hello, hello, Douglas. My name is Rahim Mohammed. I am a professor of politics and international studies at Center College in Danville, Kentucky. So I'm coming to you too on what should have been Derby Day.
Oh, wow.
Got my bourbon in hand, so I appreciate you all at least making it today something to celebrate. Although I'd much rather have the Derby, but this is a fine consolation prize for me. So the question I'm going to ask, it's been touched upon in your response to Dr. Roy, as well as to Paige in terms of the whole Jordan Peterson affair. But I wanted to ask you more directly. So you identify the origin point of our kind of current and ongoing culture of victimhood and grievance claiming as coming prior to the advent of social media and social media platforms. But how has this culture been accelerated, given the kind of reward system that's embedded in social media platforms like Twitter and like Facebook, and the types of behaviors that tend to get rewarded with things like likes and retweets and blue check marks? And to use kind of a Kentuckian expression, now that that horse is out of the barn, is there anything we can do about it to get it back in?
That's such a good question. I think there is, and I'd start by mentioning the fact that I know individuals, and I think probably you and other people have probably either known people or have seen people who this has happened with, who have gone into that world and have managed to come out of it. What I mean is people who have entered and engaged in the behavior that is rewarded in our time and have decided that it isn't something they want to engage in any longer. So, for instance, the most obvious one is people who used to find meaning in joining online mobs, at least one a day. You click on the internet, who has aired and strayed today? Let's beat them up before breakfast to demonstrate I'm a good person, and hopefully by lunch they'll have lost their job, and by dinner time I can crow about my role in it, and so on. And there's been some very interesting pieces on this. Quillette, I'm sure maybe you'll hear, has run at least two pieces I've read by people who've said, this is what I used to do. And I just realized I was not being a good person or a nice person. I was cloaking myself in the cloak of righteousness, but I was this vengeful online person finding meaning in this route. I know people, and I've spoken to people myself who've done something similar, and I think there is a learning curve that intelligent people, thoughtful people can go through on this, which is to do that for a bit and then realize that doesn't seem to give them the meaning they actually are after in life. It gives them a version of something like meaning, but it's more like a hobby, really. And then they see, of course, that it comes for them or somebody they know. That the mob comes for somebody who's, the most common one is the mob comes for somebody who says something that they thought quite recently. That's a big learning moment, because then you realize it could have come for you. And then you wonder whether or not you want to be engaged in this. But the whole thing starts from this you rightly identified the advent of technology as being the aggravating factor in this. And I think that's something, and I spent some time in Silicon Valley when researching the madness of crowds to try to find out more and understand more about the way in which the algorithms work, and much more at various companies. And I do think that the single thing people have to remember on social media platforms is that, as somebody who worked at them once said, that these are companies set up to profit by millions of people for free correcting other people's behavior. And once people work out, and my experience, by the way, also smarter, younger people, I'm thinking people after millennials, they've worked this out, or the smarter ones have worked this out, that what they have been being encouraged to be is to basically work for free for Twitter or whichever platform. And they've worked that out, that they don't see the money from it. Their friends don't see the money from it. The target doesn't see the money from it, certainly. It's something that doesn't enrich them in the technical sense, that it definitely can impoverish them if it goes wrong for them. But that then in the wider sense of enrichment, it doesn't bring what they thought it would. So my hope is that we are in era where that lesson is being learned too slowly, admittedly. But, you know, as we all know, it took decades for the actual consequences of Gutenberg to be felt. And we are in the earliest stages of this. And by the way, one other thing on that, which is, we are in the one of the ones I think about the most, which is not quite related to your question, but it just interests me, and is that we are in the earliest stages of discovering what it means when you erase the spheres of private language from the sphere of public language. And we don't know what that means. We don't know what it means when anything that anyone says could be known to the one person they're speaking to, or could be made known to the entire world. It's one of the most enormous changes in communication since we got up off our hind legs. And it's gone on in our lifetimes. And we've not noticed it particularly, but we have been living through it. And that's why I'm very sympathetic to young people growing up in this, because it's just hugely difficult if you didn't know and haven't inherited the knowledge of how we used to communicate and talk before all this.
Great. Raheem, did you have a follow-up, or did that?
Thank you so much for answering my question.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for giving me some joy on Derby Day. I appreciate it.
Oh, well, enjoy the bourbon.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Raheem. All right, let's go to our next question, which will come from Perry Foster, and then after that, we'll do a question from Esteban. So Perry first, please, and you're up, Perry. The floor is yours.
Hi, Douglas.
Hi.
Thanks for speaking to us today. I have a question regarding historical revisionism. And in Canada, we seem to be going through a paroxysm of this. Maybe that's happening in all the Western countries. Prime ministers being removed from money, textbooks being rewritten. And, you know, if you are in the know, you know these textbooks are not telling the truth. Popular shows, including groups that would never have been necessarily part of that historical epoch, or just generally distorting history. What do you think is the impulse behind this, and how can we work? Those of us who know the truth of this have either lived through a different world or have enough knowledge to know that this false history is not true. How can we fight this?
It's a tricky, the last part of that is especially tricky, but this is an incredibly important issue. I wrote about a bit of this in The Strange Death of Europe, in relation to the culture of, actually what Roger Scruton called the culture of self-abnegation. But it has the widest imaginable version in something which I've observed has been commonly, there's an absolutely simultaneous thing that has occurred in Canada, America, and Australia in particular. And it happened in the last couple of decades. Australia is the one I'm most interested in a way, because it's the country whose self-image shifted most swiftly.
Yes.
But it's the same thing that it seems to me has happened in Canada and certainly in America to a similar extent. And that is in the Australian version. I mean, maybe I can get away with talking about Australia if I don't want to talk about Canada to Canadians. I'll be caught out in serious error very early on. But you know, in Australia, it's basically the shift from the lucky country to a country mired in original sin. And one of the things I said in The Strange Death of Europe about this, and you know, Sorry Day, and in Australia, and the apologies, the historic apologies, is there's an awful lot of presumption that goes along in this. I mean, the first thing is a lot of it is clearly historically wrong and inaccurate, that's been pumped around, but there's the question that seems interesting to me is the underlying motive. What is the underlying motive for this? Again, it goes slightly back to the point I made about the young lady at Oxford who wanted her university not to find the inoculation for the virus. It seems to me very understandable that people would have an instinctive love of their country or the society they're brought up in, even if they're brought up in a society that's not that pleasant. I mean, even North Koreans, I've only been there once, but I think North Koreans sort of have some, feeling of pride in North Korea, maybe a very large amount, far too much. But a natural feeling of your society being sort of good is common, I think, very common, and as I say, is natural. It seems to me rather unnatural to want your society to be worse than it has been.
Exactly.
That seems to me something you need to be taught into, and I think there's a reason for this. I think that there is a particular desire to show societies which, and again I tread on very careful terrain here, but societies which are seen to be the product of the daughter societies of Europe have to be presented in this especially negative light. And I say that because, there are so many, every country in the world has some history of, or much history of conquest, of persecution, of wiping outs of people, of accidents that nobody could have known or expected, which are then put down to gross, bigotry of some kind, that diseases spread that no one knew they had, and there were no cures for, and much more. This is history. This is the stuff that history is made of, and I do think that there has been a concerted effort to show that Canada, America, Australia in particular, and interesting enough, in recent decades, Israel, which the critique of Israel is very often that it's sort of, it also gets critiqued both in Europe and the wider West, and also in the Middle East, as being a sort of European implant, another child of this awful Europe. And I think it's a self-lacerating thing. I think it is directed by some people. I think it's very clearly intended by some people simply to fundamentally alter the societies in question. But my beef with it is not just where it's ahistorical, but where it's just deeply unfair. I mean, my view is that we have this row that goes on every now and then in the UK about Winston Churchill.
Oh.
And it's one that interests me enormously, because I often wonder, why are you doing it, is the question I always have. Why would you be doing this? And so the Churchill critics, we had one in the former Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, who was asked what he thought of Winston Churchill, hero or villain. And he said, well, Tony Pandy, which is an incident very early in Churchill's career, where he's accused erroneously, I'm told, by his biographers, of causing the death of a minor in Wales through endorsing a police action. And anyhow, so this politician is asked, Winston Churchill, hero or villain? He says, Tony Pandy, villain. And other people who hate Churchill say, he drank too much or something. It's not seen as being a vice by all of us, but anyhow. And other people say, well, the Bengal famine, which again, by the way, they historically they deeply misrepresent. But they come up with some things which they can say show him in a bad light. And what interests me in this is not just where they're being historically inaccurate, but the fact that they would wish to be so grotesquely unfair. Because it seems to me that if we could agree on one thing, and again, this comes back slightly to the issue of truth, but if we could agree on one thing, it ought to be that if you have almost single-handedly at one point held the line and then turned the world back around and against the man we are in agreement on as being the most evil man in history, if you have a legitimate claim to take the credit, the most credit of anyone, for defeating Nazism, there ought to be a good word to put in for you every now and then.
You would think.
It seems to me. Now, but here, if I may say so, is the underlying question from that. This is a long-winded answer to your question, but I could go on all day on this question. It's just such an important and interesting question. But the thing that's interesting to me is, what might a young person looking at this take from it? And you see, my view is that among other things, it enormously degrades, demoralizes, and enervates people, because it says we as a society are so unforgiving that you could defeat Adolf Hitler, and if you'd once got drunk, you're toast. We won't forgive you. We won't say you're a good person. If you defeated Nazism, but you once made an off-color joke, nothing to be said for you anymore. Now, what does this do if you're a young person surveying this strange, unforgiving culture, which is so unforgiving in the present and so unforgiving of the past? I think what it says to young people is, it's best not to act in the world at all, because it seems nothing is good in history when people act. So maybe we should be these harmless people who wished we weren't here, because also if we weren't here, the environment would be getting on so much better, and the moss and the trees and the grass would just be having a wonderful time without us. And I worry about what this says. But as I say, I mean, I could go on all day, but my main beef with it is it's so unfair to people in history, because it makes this fundamental misunderstanding of thinking, a fundamental error of thinking that people in history acted knowing what was going to happen like we know looking back at them.
We have that a lot in Canada right now, and I'm astonished to see all these books written about Winston Churchill, that he's a rank imperialist and genocidal character. It's a huge distortion.
Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose we could just correct it by continuously pointing to factual material, or trying
yes, to... or one can always rely on the fact that whatever heroes the people who do this come up with can regularly be discovered to have been human beings themselves and to have done something wrong, which might be a learning curve for them, but never quite steep enough. Yeah.
Great. Well, Perry, thanks for the question. I think they do the same thing to Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada. So it's par for the course here. Right. So Douglas, we have 5 questions left, and I think about 15 minutes. So I think the best strategy here is maybe to do 2 questions at a time, if you're okay with that. So we'll just ask people to do succinct questions, and then you can kind of think about both of them and answer at the same time, if that's okay. So Oliver, if we can promote Estevan and Zork, and then we'll allow Estevan, you can ask your question first, and then we'll allow Zork to ask a question. So Estevan, the floor is yours.
Yes, my question is about, well, I'm trying to be as relevant as possible to the current conversation. How can we reel in minorities away from the grip of the extreme left? Because, I mean, I studied a master's in linguistics, and in that domain, like, they often talk about the white people as the oppressors, as if there weren't any historical oppression within their own communities, or as if their own communities were homogenous, which they're not. And anybody who has lived in an indigenous community knows that you can't find 2 people who think alike. And oppression is often depicted as the problem of people with less melanin, when in fact, I mean, my personal tribe has a history, and we are the culture in the Americas with the most written text about oppression of people from above on the people that belong to their local communities. And there's war, there's oppression. So how can we counter that and reel these people out of the grips of the extreme left?
Great question.
Great, thanks, Espen. And now we'll get Zork your question, please.
Hi, my question is something that you mentioned. The same question was asked of me a few years ago, and I was shocked out of my wits, realizing that I never thought about it in my life. The question is, what is your first principle?
Gosh, let me take them in order. Firstly, your area of expertise, linguistics, which is not mine, but I would make an observation, if I may, which is linguistics may be one of the hardest ones to wrestle back like that. There are a set of disciplines which I think almost have the direction of travel built into them, which I would put linguistics in. I won't get into it, not least because you'll know more, and I'll be shown up horribly. But my observation is that, for instance, it's, to put it that it's, sort of simplest, I would think that it's, if you'd said to me, I graduated in engineering, how can we take engineers back from the grip of the far left? I'd have thought, I'm not sure they are in the grip of the far. I'm not sure in any grip other than the grip of, wanting to be engineers. My point is that I think some disciplines have a tougher time on this than others. I do think that there has been a shift, however, in the last couple of decades. It's what I try to outline in the race chapter in Madness of Crowds. And I think the shift is the thing of telling people that the worth comes from the identity. We touched on a bit of this earlier. There are, in my experience, an increasing number of people who are rebelling against this. But it has been the tide in all of our countries to different extents in the last couple of decades that has been the direction of travel. And what I think is going to make a gross generalization, I think there is a counter movement now quite well underway. And some of the people we've spoken about today have been leading that. I think there's a counter movement very much underway. And it's my observation that that the smarter people coming up through university, who among other things have access to YouTube and contrary voices, have been learning for some time. They've been sold some lies, and they have an unparalleled, unprecedented opportunity now to upgrade their software on a whole range of the things that has been put into it by the education system. I'm just, enormously struck and enthused by the fact that the reaction and the rebellion against some of this is now starting to dominate in certain areas and in certain places. But there's definitely a movement against it somewhere. The question on first principle, I don't think I could say I have one first principle. I think I have a set of them, and one of them was touched on earlier, which is that I think if I had a first principle, it would probably be that the purpose of life is to pursue truth, and that it is a thing that exists and can be found, and that it isn't a relative concept. There's many other things I could go on with, but I think everything starts from there. For instance, I do believe that truth outs, and that when truth and error meet, error can't win in a fair fight. That's a pretty foundational one for me.
Great, thank you. So we have 3 questions to go. I think we should just ask them all at once, and then we can wrap this thing up in the next 10 minutes or so. So we have Yul, Andre, and Bill. Let's promote them all, and we'll start with Yul. You can go first, and the floor is yours.
Great. Hold on, sorry, I'll just get the video going. Hi, it's actually Eula.
Oh, sorry, Eula.
No worries, it's all good. Hi, Douglas. So my question is about the root causes of the identity politics and sort of the neo-left trends that you've discussed. And I grapple with this because there seem to be 2 things that I think it could be, and I wanted your thoughts. And one is sort of the decline of things that I think typically gave people meaning, such as religion and family even, and and there's sorts of, societal bulwarks that typically were the things that people would live for. And then the other one seems to be just an increase in the standard of living, and the fact that we don't necessarily want for anything. Until 1990, at least we had the communists and the Cold War to sort of give some broader perspective to our society. Whereas now, there's not that much left. And I think that perhaps as a result of not studying history or thinking about it too much, we kind of take for granted that there won't be another war. Nothing big is going to happen, nothing bad is going to happen. So the thing that we should maybe focus on, because nothing major really affects us, like hunger or lack of shelter, is that we can just tackle the remaining bigotry that there is. So those are the two things that I grapple with, and I just wanted your thoughts.
Great, thank you, Yoli. Let's go to Andre for your question, please.
Yeah, I'd like to circle back to where Candice started, the comment on the C-19 reaction or overreaction. I agree with you, Douglas, that I think we all need to be better informed before we draw any conclusions or maybe change our minds about things. But that said, one of our members, Professor Hardy, wrote what I thought was a great article in one of our national newspapers. The headline was, "Let's not double down on the nanny state." And I compare that with a number of other pieces that I've read that have made the point, or tried to make the point, that those who now question the central importance of the administrative state in our society have been proven wrong once and for all. It strikes me as awfully presumptuous, and again, time will tell, but I'd really be curious to get your reaction to that idea.
Great. Thank you, Andre. And final question will come from Bill Brooks. Bill.
Hi, Douglas. Thank you. Since we all sort of live in the North Atlantic triangle here, I just couldn't let the sort of afternoon go by without getting your opinion on the state of the race in the United States. Some of my good conservative friends absolutely suffer from Trump disarrangement syndrome, and I know that there are cringeworthy moments and so on and so forth, but I'd be interested to know how you think he stacks up against a party that basically exemplifies most of the error that you have pointed out throughout your last 3 books.
Well, thank you for all of those. Let me do them in order. Why has this come about? Eula asks. I think you pretty much covered it. It is these things you refer to. It is the product of wealthy late modernity societies where there's not enough going bad for people's comfort, and so they would like to see things going bad that aren't going on in order to feel heroic in some way. This is what idea I lifted from the late, with credit I should stress, from the late Australian political philosopher Ken Minogue, who referred to this as St. George in retirement syndrome, that St. George gets so much acclaim for having slain the dragon that he staggers around the land looking for more dragons to slay, and it's possible that he might not find any more dragons and start killing smaller and smaller animals, and finally one day may even be found swinging his sword into thin air. And I do think that to a great extent the so-called social justice warriors and others have been doing that. They have been, if not swinging their swords at thin air, then they've been swinging them at basically small animals that are not that threatening, or not as threatening as they like to pretend, in order to pursue their heroic pose. I think the decline of religion that you refer to is obviously a huge thing in that. I think I say in The Strange Death of Europe, I think one of the oddest things in our societies is that as religion has receded from them, we haven't paid enough attention to the fact that our instinct for it would, of course, remain. Whether you think that's an instinct because we're meaning-seeking creatures or because we're meaning-seeking creatures and there is meaning. Whichever of those paths you take, it's extraordinary to just lose the idea, lose your explanation, and then not think that people are going to search for things to fill that void. And I think a huge amount of the of this can be explained that way. And by the way, the most obvious one is, again, the reminder that the so-called activists always remind us of, which is, of course, that if you're going to really behave appallingly, you have to think you're doing so in the name of good. And that's something they demonstrate, I think daily. C19 state control. I haven't read that piece in question. I will look that up. There are several things to say. The first is, I think it's true that whenever a crisis comes along like this, which not very many, it isn't true to say that it's unexpected. There were people who were expecting them, but they were in their own silos and they weren't particularly widely listened to, because there are lots of things that can happen and go wrong, and you know, the experts were considering it, but wider society was not. I'm very aware that in recent weeks, people who've never thought about pandemics before have found this pandemic to miraculously vindicate all their pre-existing beliefs on things that had nothing to do with pandemics. So, you know, people whose big beef was inequality, you know, are saying that this is why inequality needs to be addressed more. By the way, this is an error of the left and right and everyone else as well. I mean, you know, there are right-wing figures who have been using this to justify their own pre-existing views. There's no doubt about it that the state, I mean, for instance, the NHS in the UK comes out of this just immeasurably stronger than when it went in. I don't think any government of right or left will be able to talk about even diminishing growth in spending on the NHS ever again, or I mean, not for decades. And the one thing I would say on the sort of security state thing is, one of our former members of the Supreme Court, Sumption, warned about the police state sort of emergence in Britain. I'm not by any means sort of blithe about this, but I think that there's enough. I think the public don't react well when there's police overreach, for instance. There has been police overreach in the UK, and there's been enormous pushback against it, to the extent that, you know, the police have been told not to do some of the overreach they've done. So I don't know. My own view is that with futurology, what people always have to bear in mind is the possibility that all things happen, and that it's not a case of, you know, we'll have more state or less, or more identity politics or less identity politics. So I think that it's possible for everybody to double down on what their thing is in the wake of an event like this. So that, for instance, I think some people will become far more cautious in their behavior. And I think some people will become very incautious. It's like many people will not go to live music events for a long time to come, even after the governments say it's safe to do so. Other people will say, you know, I'm willing to take the risk because I just can't not do that. And I think all of these things are likely to happen simultaneously. I don't think any of it is written. The third and final question, the US presidential race, we were getting along so well, and then you introduced the subject of Donald Trump into it. I do watch it. I don't have any greater insight than anyone else, really. I mean, I've followed American politics pretty closely all my life, but everybody now has a view on American politics, and it's almost like a soap opera, of course, in everybody's lives all around the planet every day. I think the one thing I would say is, yes, the Democratic Party has shifted enormously in recent years, but then so has the Republican Party. And we have lived through a decade in which at any point, either of the main parties could have split completely. And that strikes me as being very interesting. We were talking about the immediate demolition of the Republican Party until Donald Trump won the election. And then everyone was talking about the possibility the Democrats were going to fall apart. They have moved an enormous amount. I think it's still telling that they have ended up with the safest imaginable option for them in a presidential candidate who is clearly not fit to run, it seems to me. I mean, I think from what I see, somebody very close to Joe Biden should say, you're not going to make yourself or us proud if you go ahead with this. He better make sure he gets a very good vice presidential nominee, running mate. I also think it's going to be, I mean, it goes without saying, it's going to be the ugliest election race ever. Every election race in America is the ugliest, but there's always somewhere further low down you can go. I think that Donald Trump will murder Joe Biden on stage, frankly, and I don't say that with enormous relish, because as was shown in the Trump-Clinton debates, there's just nothing Trump won't do, including, you know, parading all of the candidates' husbands, ex-girlfriends and mistresses. You know, I mean, what he'll do with Biden will be brutal. And the truth is, it'll be brutal because it's not hard to be brutal with Biden at this point. I just think that the American public who are turned off by all of this are right to be turned off by it. And I just feel torn myself, because America is in such a degraded place today, politically and culturally and journalistically and much more. You know, Trump is right about the media to a great extent, but I hate thinking he's the cure for it, and much more. It's one of the times when I'm very glad I live in the UK. I might even be glad to live in Canada rather than America. I don't know, but it might sound like I'm a Canadian audience. But these have been enormously interesting and wide-ranging and very stimulating. I have to say, very educated. I think it's one of the most credentialed audiences I've spoken to. So I should also thank all of you for the questions. They've been really stimulating.
Well, thank you, Douglas. We just really admire your ability to touch on so many topics at once. I've gotten so many messages and emails from Civitas members thanking you for your time, for your insight, for your thoughtfulness, and we really appreciate you spending the time with us today, giving up your Saturday evening. So thank you so much from Civitas. We hope to keep in touch. And to everyone watching, all the Civitas members, thank you for your contribution and for listening and for engaging with us. It's really been a fun, stimulating afternoon for me here in Toronto, and hopefully for you, Douglas, as well. So from all of us at Civitas, thank you so much. And that brings the end to our session. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Candice, and stay well.
Great, thank you.